it wasn't announced, it wasn't explained. But when Prince William quietly removed Princess Beatrice from the guest registry of 3 major palace events, insiders knew this wasn't protocol, it was punishment. And at the center of it all stood Princess Eugenie, whose alleged betrayal had just detonated inside the House of Windsor. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made the move so chilling wasn't just the decision itself, it was the silence that followed. No statement from Kensington Palace. No polite explanation framed in diplomatic language. Just absence. Names quietly erased from lists that, until recently, had been carefully curated symbols of unity and continuity. Those who monitor royal movements closely began to notice the pattern almost immediately. Invitations that once carried Beatrice's name simply didn't arrive. Appearances that once felt routine suddenly moved forward without her presence, as though a quiet recalibration had taken place behind closed doors. And within palace corridors, where even the smallest shift can signal something far greater, the atmosphere reportedly grew tense, almost brittle, as aides avoided eye contact and conversations became clipped, cautious, deliberate. Senior aides, speaking in hushed tones, would later describe the move as unprecedented, a word rarely used lightly in an institution built on centuries of controlled continuity. Because this wasn't just about attendance. It wasn't about scheduling conflicts or public optics. This was something sharper, something deliberate, a line drawn with precision. And those familiar with the internal rhythms of royal life understood exactly what that meant. When someone is quietly removed without explanation, it is rarely accidental. It is a signal, a warning, a message intended not just for one person, but for everyone watching. The timing only deepened the mystery. In the weeks leading up to this quiet exclusion, subtle tensions had already begun to surface within the York sisters' orbit. Appearances felt slightly out of sync. Engagements that once showcased effortless alignment now carried an undercurrent of distance. And then came the whispers, faint at first, almost dismissible. Talk of a breach of trust, of something shared that should never have left the inner circle. Palace insiders, usually careful to avoid speculation, began to hint that the issue wasn't personal in the conventional sense. It wasn't about disagreement or rivalry. It was about something far more serious, something that touched the very foundation of how trust operates within the monarchy. And at the center of those whispers was Eugenie. Not openly accused, not publicly confronted, but quietly positioned as the origin point of a disruption that had forced William into action. Reports suggest that whatever had occurred was not seen as a minor misstep, but as a destabilizing moment, one that required a response both swift and unmistakable. And in choosing to act through Beatrice, William's decision carried an added layer of complexity, because this wasn't just about addressing a perceived betrayal. It was about reinforcing a principle that proximity to power comes with responsibility, and when that responsibility is questioned, the consequences ripple outward, affecting even those who may not have been directly involved. The silence from the palace only amplified the tension. In a world where every gesture is scrutinized and every absence analyzed, saying nothing can often say the most. And as observers began to piece together what little information was available, a clearer picture started to emerge, not complete, not confirmed, but enough to suggest that something significant had shifted beneath the surface. Something that had forced William to act not as a cousin, but as a future king. And as the implications of that decision continued to unfold, one question lingered, growing louder with each passing day. But what could possibly justify such a drastic and public exclusion within a family that prides itself on unity? For years, they had presented a united front, smiling side by side at royal weddings and balcony appearances. But behind the polished images, insiders now suggest that the bond between Prince William and the York sisters had been quietly deteriorating long before this moment. What once appeared effortless, almost familial in its warmth, is now being re-examined through a far more critical lens. Because in a system as tightly controlled as the monarchy, relationships rarely fracture overnight. They erode slowly, subtly, in ways that are easy to miss until suddenly they are impossible to ignore. There was a time when William, Princess Beatrice, and Princess Eugenie moved within the same orbit with a kind of natural ease. They were part of the same generational wave, bound not just by blood but by shared experience growing up under scrutiny, navigating expectation, learning the unspoken rules of a life that offered privilege but demanded discipline. Those early years, according to longtime royal observers, created a foundation of trust that seemed unshakable. They attended the same gatherings, supported the same causes, and presented, at least publicly, a sense of cohesion that reinforced the image of a united royal front. But over time, something began to shift, not dramatically, not in ways that would immediately capture headlines. Instead, it showed up in the margins, in the subtle recalibration of appearances, in the quiet absence from certain engagements, in the way interactions began to feel more formal, more measured. Observers started to notice that the easy familiarity once shared between William and the York sisters was being replaced by something more distant. Conversations, it was said, became shorter. Engagements became more selective. And while nothing openly signaled conflict, the absence of closeness began to speak volumes. Reports suggest that beneath this gradual distancing were deeper, more complex tensions tied to loyalty and alignment within the evolving structure of the royal family. As William stepped further into his role as the future king, his priorities began to sharpen, focusing increasingly on stability, control, and the long-term preservation of the institution. And within that framework, every relationship began to carry weight not just personal, but strategic. Those within palace circles began to whisper about differing loyalties, about subtle but significant divides forming between various branches of the family. And in that shifting landscape, Eugenie occupied a uniquely sensitive position. She was, in many ways, a bridge, someone who maintained connections across different factions within the royal sphere. That role, once seen as an asset, may have gradually become a point of concern. Because being a bridge also means being a conduit. And in an environment where information is tightly guarded and trust is paramount, even the perception of blurred boundaries can be enough to raise alarms. Insiders began to suggest that Eugenie's connections, her ability to move between circles with relative ease, may have unintentionally placed her at the center of growing unease. Not because of any single action, but because of what that position represented in a time of increasing sensitivity. As these undercurrents intensified, early signs of mistrust reportedly began to surface in private conversations, subtle at first, almost cautious, but unmistakable to those paying attention. Questions were raised. Boundaries were quietly reinforced. And while nothing had yet reached the level of open confrontation, the foundation of trust that once defined these relationships was beginning to crack. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And in the world of the monarchy, where perception and reality often intertwine, even the smallest fracture can carry enormous consequences. What makes this unraveling so significant is not just the distance itself, but what it suggests about the pressures now shaping the next generation of royal leadership. William is no longer simply a cousin or a peer, he is the future of the institution. And with that role comes a different lens through which every relationship is evaluated. Loyalty is no longer assumed. It is tested, measured, and, when necessary, enforced. And as those quiet tensions continued to build beneath the surface, moving from unspoken discomfort to something far more serious, those closest to palace operations began to sense that this was not a passing phase. It was a shift, a turning point, one that had been forming for months, perhaps even years. And when it finally broke into the open, it would not do so gently, because according to those closest to palace operations, that quiet tension would soon erupt into something far more damaging. It is now whispered in the highest royal circles that Princess Eugenie didn't just cross a line, she exposed something that was never meant to leave palace walls. And once that information surfaced, there was no going back. What had been building quietly beneath the surface, what had lingered as unease and suspicion, suddenly took on a sharper, more dangerous form. Because this was no longer about subtle distance or shifting loyalties. This was about breach. About trust fractured in a way that could not simply be repaired with silence or time. The allegations, though never formally acknowledged, began to circulate with increasing urgency. Reports suggest that confidential information, details tightly held within the inner workings of the royal household, had somehow made its way beyond its intended boundaries, not in a dramatic headline-grabbing reveal, but in fragments, pieces, enough to raise alarm among those responsible for protecting the institution's most guarded realities. And in a system where discretion is not just expected but demanded, even the smallest leak can carry enormous weight. Because it's never just about what was shared, it's about what it represents. There are suggestions, whispered carefully and often behind closed doors, that these fragments may have reached individuals outside the immediate royal sphere. Media figures, external contacts, people who operate in a world where information is currency, and where even the faintest insight into royal affairs can be amplified into something far larger. Nothing has been confirmed. Nothing has been proven. But within palace circles, perception can be just as powerful as fact. And the perception, according to those familiar with the situation, was enough to trigger concern at the highest levels. What made the situation even more volatile was the timing. The alleged leak did not occur in isolation. It coincided with a period of heightened sensitivity within the royal family, moments when internal matters required absolute discretion, when stability was not just preferred, but essential. And so, when whispers of shared information began to surface during this already fragile period, the reaction was swift, even if it remained largely unseen. Palace insiders would later describe the situation as deeply destabilizing, not because of a single revelation, but because of the ripple effect it created. Questions began to surface. Who knew what? Who could be trusted? And perhaps most importantly, how far had the information traveled? For Prince William, the implications were not just institutional, they were personal. Reports suggest that his response was shaped not only by his role as a future king, but by a sense of betrayal that cut far deeper than protocol. This was not a distant relative or an external critic. This was family. Someone who had grown up within the same system, who understood the weight of discretion, who knew exactly what it meant to protect the inner workings of the monarchy. And that is what made it so difficult to ignore. Because when trust is broken from within, the consequences are never contained. They spread. They force decisions that might otherwise have been avoided. Those close to the situation suggest that William did not react impulsively. There was no immediate confrontation, no public fallout. Instead, there was a measured response, quiet, controlled, but unmistakably firm. The kind of response that signals a shift not just in action, but in mindset. Because this was no longer about preserving relationships at all costs. It was about safeguarding the institution, even if that meant making choices that would inevitably cause strain within the family itself. And as the weight of that decision began to settle, as the implications of Eugenie's alleged actions continued to unfold behind the scenes, one detail stood out with increasing clarity. The consequences, at least in their earliest form, were not directed at Eugenie alone. They extended outward, touching those closest to her, drawing others into the fallout of a situation they may not have directly controlled. Which is why, as the story continued to develop and the palace maintained its silence, a new and far more complicated question began to take shape. But if Eugenie was at the center of the storm, why was Beatrice the one facing immediate consequences? She hadn't spoken publicly. She hadn't defended herself. And yet, Princess Beatrice found herself on the outside looking in, as if she were carrying the weight of a betrayal she didn't commit. The silence surrounding her was not protective. It was isolating. And in a family where presence is power and visibility is validation, her sudden absence from key moments spoke louder than any statement ever could. It raised questions that no one inside the palace seemed willing to answer directly, but everyone was quietly trying to understand, to grasp why Beatrice became entangled in a situation that, by most accounts, centered on Princess Eugenie. One has to look at the nature of their bond. The York sisters have long been seen as inseparable two halves of a unit that moved together, supported one another, and operated with a shared sense of identity. Their closeness was not just personal, it was structural. They were often treated as a pair, invited as a pair, considered as a pair, and within the rigid framework of royal dynamics, that kind of pairing carries consequences. Because when one part of the unit is questioned, the shadow inevitably falls on the other. This is where the situation becomes more complex, more emotionally layered. Palace tradition, according to those familiar with its inner workings, does not always distinguish between individual actions when it comes to closely aligned figures. Instead, it responds to perceived risk as a whole. And in this case, that meant Beatrice was drawn into the fallout not because of something she had done, but because of her proximity to someone who had become the focus of concern. Reports have described her position as collateral damage, a phrase that feels cold, almost clinical, but one that captures the harsh reality of how decisions are sometimes made within the monarchy. For Prince William, the decision to distance Beatrice may have served a purpose that went beyond the immediate situation. It was, according to some insiders, a strategic move, one designed to send a message that loyalty and discretion are not optional, and that the consequences of perceived breaches extend beyond the individual. By creating distance not just from Eugenie, but from her closest ally, William reinforced a boundary. A line that, once drawn, would be difficult for anyone within the royal circle to ignore. But strategy does not erase emotion. And for Beatrice, the impact of that decision appears to have been deeply personal. Her absence from major palace events did not go unnoticed. Observers began to question why someone who had once been a consistent presence was suddenly missing from occasions that would normally include her. There were no explanations, no reassurances, just a quiet withdrawal that seemed to confirm that something significant had shifted. And while the public saw only the surface, those closer to the situation suggest that the emotional toll was far more profound. Being excluded without explanation, being left to navigate speculation without the ability to respond, creates a kind of pressure that is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. What makes this moment particularly striking is the contrast it reveals. On one side, the image of royal unity, carefully maintained and publicly presented. On the other, the reality of internal decisions that can isolate even those who have done nothing wrong. It is a reminder that within the monarchy, belonging is not guaranteed, it is contingent. And when that sense of belonging is disrupted, the effects ripple outward, reshaping relationships and redefining roles in ways that are not always visible, but always felt. As the situation continued to evolve, it became increasingly clear that this was not simply a matter of temporary exclusion or quiet disapproval. There was a deeper intention behind the decisions being made, a deliberate effort to establish control and reinforce authority at a time when uncertainty was growing. And what followed next wasn't just exclusion, it was a carefully calculated move designed to reinforce authority. There were no speeches, no confrontations, just a series of quiet decisions that made one thing unmistakably clear. Prince William was drawing a line and enforcing it with surgical precision. What unfolded in the days that followed did not resemble a family disagreement or a fleeting moment of tension. It felt controlled, intentional, almost clinical in its execution. Because within the monarchy, power is rarely displayed through noise. It is asserted through action, through subtle shifts that carry unmistakable weight for those who understand how the system truly operates. The removal of Princess Beatrice from palace events was never publicly framed as punishment. Instead, it was quietly categorized under what insiders describe as administrative adjustments, a phrase that sounds routine, almost harmless, but one that often conceals far more deliberate intent. Invitations were recalibrated. Guest lists were refined. Appearances were reorganized. On the surface, everything appeared orderly, even procedural. But beneath that surface, the message was clear. Access could be granted. And just as easily, it could be withdrawn. This was not just about one individual. It was about reinforcing the structure itself. Reports suggest that William's actions were guided by a growing awareness of his future role not just as a figurehead, but as the central authority within an institution that depends on discipline to survive. And in that context, hierarchy is not symbolic, it is operational. Every decision, every inclusion or exclusion, serves to define the boundaries of that hierarchy. By stepping in and making these adjustments without hesitation, William signaled that those boundaries were not negotiable. What makes this moment particularly significant is the shift it represents in William's approach to leadership. For years, he had been seen as measured, careful, sometimes even reluctant to assert control in ways that might disrupt family harmony. But this was different. This was decisive. It suggested a willingness to prioritize the stability of the institution over the comfort of personal relationships. And for those watching closely, it marked a transition from heir to active enforcer of the monarchy's internal order. The implications of that shift did not go unnoticed. Within palace circles, where every action is interpreted and every decision carries meaning, William's move was understood as a signal, not just to Beatrice, not just to Princess Eugenie, but to everyone within the extended royal network. Loyalty, discretion, alignment, these were no longer assumed qualities. They were expectations that would be monitored, evaluated, and, if necessary, enforced. And the method of enforcement would not be loud or dramatic. It would be quiet, controlled, and impossible to ignore. Palace staff, according to those familiar with internal operations, were given clear instructions to maintain strict discretion. Conversations were to remain contained. Speculation was to be avoided. The situation, whatever its full scope, was to be handled internally, without escalation into public view. And yet, the very act of enforcing silence often has the opposite effect. It heightens awareness. It sharpens curiosity. Because when something is deliberately kept quiet, it signals that there is something worth hiding. As these decisions continued to unfold, the atmosphere within the royal household reportedly grew more cautious, more deliberate. Interactions were measured. Movements were observed. And beneath it all, there was a growing recognition that something fundamental had shifted not just in relationships, but in how authority was being exercised. This was no longer about maintaining appearances. It was about control, about ensuring that the structure held, even under pressure. But within the fragile ecosystem of the monarchy, every action triggers a reaction, and this one was no exception. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere reportedly shifted overnight. Conversations became guarded. Invitations were scrutinized. And suddenly, everyone seemed to be choosing sides. What had once been an environment governed by routine and quiet coordination now carried an edge subtle, but unmistakable. Those who worked within the inner machinery of the monarchy began to sense it immediately. The tone had changed. Not dramatically, not in ways that would alarm an outsider, but enough to signal that something serious had taken hold beneath the surface. Within the network of aides and courtiers, divisions began to form, not openly, not in a way that could be easily traced, but through small, telling shifts in behavior. Some remained firmly aligned with Prince William, interpreting his actions as necessary, even overdue. Others, however, were said to be more cautious, concerned about the broader implications of such decisive moves within a family already navigating delicate internal dynamics. These weren't confrontations. They were quiet recalibrations: who spoke to whom, who shared information, who chose to remain silent. And in a system where discretion is currency, even silence can reveal allegiance. At the center of this tightening web of tension stood King Charles III, reportedly caught in a position that was as complex as it was fragile. As monarch, he carries the responsibility of maintaining unity, of ensuring that the institution presents a cohesive front. But as a father and a long-standing figure within the family, he is also deeply aware of the personal costs such divisions can carry. Reports suggest that Charles has been navigating this situation with careful restraint, avoiding direct intervention while quietly observing how events unfold. It is a delicate balance, one that requires patience, but also carries the risk of allowing tensions to deepen if left unresolved. Senior royals, those with experience in managing crises that never reach public view, are said to have moved quickly to contain the fallout. Conversations were held behind closed doors. Strategies were discussed, not for confrontation, but for control. The priority, according to insiders, was not to assign blame publicly, but to prevent the situation from escalating into something that could damage the monarchy's carefully maintained image. Because in an era where every detail can be amplified and every rumor can gain traction, perception is everything. And the perception of division, if left unchecked, can be as damaging as the reality itself. This is where the concern begins to extend beyond the immediate circle. There is an awareness, reportedly growing among those closest to the situation, that if the story were to break beyond palace walls, it could reshape public understanding of the royal family's internal stability. The absence of figures like Princess Beatrice has already begun to attract attention. Observers are asking questions. Patterns are being noted. And while no official narrative has been offered, the lack of explanation only fuels speculation. In response, secrecy has intensified. Access to information has been tightened. Discussions that might once have flowed more freely are now carefully managed, with an emphasis on containment. Those within palace operations are said to be operating with heightened awareness, knowing that even the smallest detail, if mishandled, could contribute to a narrative that is rapidly forming outside their control. It is a defensive posture, one designed to protect, but also one that underscores the seriousness of the situation. And yet, despite all these efforts, despite the careful management and the deliberate silence, there is a growing sense that the situation has already moved beyond the point of quiet resolution. Because once tension reaches a certain threshold, once actions begin to ripple outward, containment becomes increasingly difficult. And in this case, the ripple effects were not staying confined within palace corridors, they were beginning to spread, quietly but steadily, far beyond them. And yet, despite all efforts to contain it, the ripple effects were already spreading far beyond palace walls. To the public, nothing had changed. But to those watching closely, the absences spoke louder than any statement ever could. The royal calendar continued. Events unfolded with the same polished rhythm. Appearances were made, hands were shaken, traditions upheld. And yet, something was missing. Someone was missing. Princess Beatrice, once a familiar presence at high-profile gatherings, had quietly disappeared from the spaces where she was once expected to stand. Not officially removed, not publicly addressed, just gone. And in a system where visibility is carefully managed, that kind of absence is never accidental. At first, it was subtle, easy to overlook. A single event missed, then another. But patterns have a way of revealing themselves, especially to those who follow the monarchy with precision. Royal watchers began to take note. Invitations that would traditionally include Beatrice no longer bore her name. Engagements that once featured her now moved forward without acknowledgement of her absence. And while the palace offered no explanation, the silence itself became a form of communication, one that suggested intention rather than coincidence. As days turned into weeks, speculation began to intensify. Media outlets, cautious at first, started to raise questions. Not accusations, not declarations, just carefully framed observations. Why was Beatrice absent? Was it personal? Was it strategic? Was it temporary? Or something more permanent? The lack of clarity only fueled the intrigue, because in the absence of official information, every detail becomes significant. Every shift, every omission, every subtle change in pattern is examined, interpreted, and woven into a narrative that continues to grow. At the same time, Princess Eugenie appeared to retreat into the background. Her presence, once consistent, became more restrained. Fewer appearances, less visibility. A lower profile that, according to some observers, felt deliberate. Not an admission of guilt, not a confirmation of anything specific, but a response nonetheless. And in the context of the unfolding situation, that response only added another layer of complexity. Because when both sisters step back, whether by choice or by circumstance, it reinforces the sense that something significant is unfolding behind the scenes. The monarchy, for its part, remained silent. No statements, no clarifications, no attempts to correct or redirect the growing speculation. And this silence, far from passive, appeared to be part of a broader strategy. Control through absence, containment through restraint. By refusing to engage publicly, the institution maintained its authority over the narrative, allowing events to unfold without external interference. It is a method that has been used before, one that relies on time, discipline, and the understanding that attention will eventually shift. But it is also a method that carries risk, because silence can protect, but it can also provoke. What makes this moment particularly tense is the contrast it creates. On one side, the monarchy continues to project stability, continuity, and unity. On the other, the gaps in that projection are becoming harder to ignore. The missing figures, the unanswered questions, the growing sense that something important is being withheld. And for those watching closely, these contradictions are impossible to reconcile without assuming that there is more to the story than what is being shown. As the speculation deepens and the silence persists, the situation begins to take on a life of its own. Narratives form, theories emerge, and with each passing day, the pressure builds not just on those directly involved, but on the institution itself, because maintaining silence requires control. And control becomes increasingly difficult when the outside world begins to fill in the gaps. But silence, in the world of royal power, is rarely the end of the story, it's often just the beginning. What began as a quiet decision has now exposed something far deeper, a fracture within the royal family that may not heal as easily as past divisions. What once seemed like a controlled response to a contained issue has slowly revealed itself to be something far more significant. Something that reaches beyond a single moment and into the future of the monarchy itself. Because this is no longer just about an absence from events or a silent adjustment behind palace doors. It is about consequence.